Welcome back to Texas in Focus. My guest on the program today is Kate Rogers, the former CEO and president of the Alamo Trust. Kate, thank you so much for joining the program today.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Let's start with this, the basic question. Tell us about your path to the Alamo. If there's two kinds of jobs, your dream jobs or the just a job kind of jobs, which one was the Alamo for you?
Oh, it's definitely a dream job for sure. So I spent a lot of my career in the corporate world. I worked at HEB for almost 18 years. Worked on a lot of the company's education initiatives in partnership with Charles Butt. And then when I left the company, I went to go work for him and his foundation, starting the Holsworth Center in Austin, and then some of his charitable work in San Antonio and South Texas. And I got called from a recruiter one day about the Alamo Trust and didn't know much about it at the time and was glad that I took advantage of the opportunity.
So before, the incidents, the kind of that I want to ask you about, let's talk about your 4 years at the Alamo before October 2025. The project you were in charge of, the renovations, the master plan going on over there. How was that project moving along and what were your relationships like, pre everything happening?
Yeah, so I mean, in general, I think the project was moving along well. I mean, there's a lot of emotion surrounding the Alamo. There was a ton of controversy when I got there. There was a lot going on that needed to be calmed, I would say, relationships that had been fractured, specifically in the local community in San Antonio. Um, and people around the state were skeptical if the project was ever actually going to happen because we've been talking about it so long. There was the plan that was advanced before my arrival that went to the THC and was voted down after a very, very lengthy day of testimony. Um, it wasn't easy for sure. Like I said, there was a lot of relationship building that had to be done. And I feel like, it wasn't always smooth sailing, but in general, not just myself, but I think between myself and the team, we were able to build bridges with just about, everybody who had a big, who cared a lot about what happens to the Alamo.
Well, it's starting to look beautiful over there. So yeah, I know y'all were doing something right because I
We
see a lot of
were.
big changes there.
We have
Um,
to remember that when I got there, there was no design that anyone could generate consensus around. There was no money, right? There was $400,000 in the bank in the Remember the Alamo Foundation account. When I left, there was just shy of 90 million. Um, we were successful in securing two very large appropriations from the legislature with a lot of help. Again, I'm not taking credit for all that happened there. There was a lot that the board did. There was a lot that the lieutenant governor did, that the land commissioner did, as well as the other members of the legislature. So it was, very much a partnership.
So we started the events, of October of your posting. The Alamo was posting Happy Columbus Day, post Happy Indigenous Peoples Day. Seems like, there's something there for everybody, rather innocuous. So why was this such a controversy?
It's a great question. I'm not sure I 100% know the answer to that, other than, we're living in different times right now, I think, in many respects. Heightened divisiveness across the country. You're seeing, just people really digging in on their stance one way or the other, and people losing their jobs over it, like mine. It's kind of becoming pervasive, which I find frightening and alarming as an American citizen.
And when I was researching this, I noticed, a lot of people's critique of the land commissioner who criticized the post y'all made at the Alamo was that basically what she was doing wasn't a good faith critique of the Alamo, was more scoring political points. Do you think there's anything to that?
Well, I mean, if you look the way it all went down, right? So you have Michael Quinn Sullivan, who obviously is a rather controversial political figure, who sort of called her out on social media, saying, "Who thought this was a good idea?" The interesting thing is that, we posted the same thing last year and maybe even the year before, and nobody said anything, which shows you kind of where we are and the amount of surveillance that is happening on people's activities on the internet, on social media, etc. And so I'm not 100% sure why the reaction, in my view, the reaction was quite extreme, right? There needs to be accountability, questioned my leadership, who's monitoring this, sort of a somebody's got to pay for this, sort of tone to the communication that was sent to my board, not to me, to the board. And unfortunately, because of that, what I felt was an overcorrection, an overreaction to something. Once we were made aware, once I received a phone call from the commissioner's chief of staff, we took the post down, and it happened rather quickly. So I'm not sure, but because of the reaction, the person who was in charge of communications at the Alamo Trust at the time lost his job and he had to resign. And he's, was a very talented, very committed employee with two small children at home. Um, that I offered to resign at that time in his place because I didn't agree with the decision. And at that time, which was just 1 week before I officially stepped down, the board said no, they wouldn't even consider my resignation. We also terminated the contract with Texas author Stephen Harrigan, who was writing the script for the new museum, over additional accusations from the land commissioner about specifically the utilization of words like enslaved and slavery within the script versus words like freedom and liberty. Someone had done a word count of the number of times those phrases were used, which in my view is not necessarily a great way to judge the value of a historic script, you know.
I certainly agree with you there. Let me ask you this because, just from the outside looking in, it looks like almost everybody at the city level or at the county level defended you, whether it's the mayor, the former county judge. Um, and, this was kind of billed, I thought, when they started this plan as a partnership between the city and the state.
Mhm.
But when you see that everybody at the local level defended you and everybody at the state level kind of wanted you out, does it seem like, maybe the state has kind of usurped control of this whole thing and it's not so much of a partnership anymore?
Well, I can say by the time that I left, it didn't feel like much of a partnership. It felt more like an authoritarian regime, if you will. Like we're going to make the decisions and you're going to do what you're told. And I think for a certain kind of person, that's probably fine. I felt I had a responsibility in my job first and foremost to do what was right and in the best interest of the Alamo as our most treasured historic site, right? I took that responsibility very seriously in terms of key decisions like the replacement of the roof and what the replacement would look like and would it be in keeping with the Secretary of the Interior standards, right? Those are big decisions that have, generational impact potentially. I also felt that way about the script. We had so many people give input into the script. It was a years long process with multiple stakeholders. So when you get into can you use the word indigenous or not, that word came about through literally like 3 years of conversations with local stakeholders, with people from the local indigenous community, descendants of the people who lived here thousands of years ago, who had their own views about the way they wanted their story told. And I felt we had an obligation to honor those views.
And I will say through my research, it looks like everybody on all sides, left and right, had been pretty complimentary of your leadership up till, you know, right when this happened. So I did want to add that in there. But let me ask you this. Um, Not everybody lives through a political firestorm. Not everybody lives through being in the spotlight like that, where, the land commissioner and the lieutenant governor are calling for your job. What is that just for you? What does that do to one's psyche, kind of being in the middle of a political firestorm?
Well, I wouldn't recommend it, that's for sure. It was just so jarring because, it all happened for me within 24 hours. I get this call from the lieutenant governor, who honestly I had a lot of respect for. I didn't know him before I took the Alamo role politically. I tried to keep my personal views about anything out of my job, and I think I did that well, to be honest with you. I didn't let what I believed influence, you know, much of what we were doing. And I didn't always agree with him about the decisions he made, right? As we don't with most politicians, right? Most people would say, yes, I supported that, but not that. But I found him to be very intelligent. His passion for history and for the Alamo were quite genuine. And we had a good working relationship right up until the very end. The commissioner was challenging, I think, she had a view that, she should be running the Alamo and the decisions made there. She's a very ambitious person who has big political aspirations. And I think she saw the Alamo as a way to help, boost that career and maybe propel her into a higher office. Which she's not shy about saying that's what she wants. So, she could be tough at times and unpredictable. And so, but we did the best we could. I can say this with 100% honesty. I was never disrespectful to her. When she asked for me to do something like remove a book from the gift shop or take down a social media post, we obliged, even if we didn't agree with the decision. It wasn't our place to disagree. She's a statewide elected official and she deserved our respect.
And I think that segues perfectly into my next question because I know in the lawsuit you filed against the Alamo Trust, one of the goals is to be reinstated into your previous job as the CEO. But I guess after all that these folks have put you through, including the land commissioner and the lieutenant governor, if you were to be reinstated, could you work with these people again?
It's a great question. I mean, they all have to get reelected first. So there's that, because they're all up for reelection in November. And it was interesting because, so you asked about what it's like. I will say one of the most surprising things to me, because I have never been a political or a public figure, if you will, right? But through this, people had read my story. And so almost everywhere I went, be that the grocery store, the yoga studio, to see a show at the Majestic, someone would approach me and say, "Hi, you don't know me. I'm so and so. And I just want to say thank you for standing your ground, for speaking up. I support you. Let me know how I can help." I've gotten calls from people, but I also have people come and say to me, "You need to run against them." Like this needs to change, and you're the person to do it. Now, obviously, I didn't choose to go that route because that seems like, even more fraught with potential controversy. But I thought it was interesting that that was how some, I mean, I had even had one of my neighbors who was very persistent and saying, "I'll be your treasurer. I'll get you in front of every garden club from here to Abilene. Let's go. I know what you should say on your t-shirts."
Let me ask you this because I remember in 2019, the 2020 era, when there was talk, the original Alamo plan, of course, had the cenotaph being moved. And I know this
Yes.
predates you, but I think this is interesting because I remember when they were moving it, when I live in downtown San Antonio. When I go on my run, I would notice there were these kind of armed groups there
Yeah.
defending the cenotaph. And I mean, some pretty serious weaponry, some rifles and stuff. And, eventually this armed group kind of got their way. We ended up not moving the cenotaph. And it always
Yeah.
kind of left a sour taste in my mouth that these folks that were just coming to the city every week with guns, got their way on this. And I can't help but feel, all these years later, with your ouster and the way it was conducted, um, that things like that might have been like the original sin and it was a harbinger of things to come. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like I said, emotions run very high as it surrounds the Alamo, and This is Texas Freedom Force are the people that you're mentioning. And yeah, I mean, there was a terrible incident where there was a Black Lives Rally matter in downtown San Antonio. This is Texas Freedom Force was protesting the movement of the cenotaph. The two groups got into it with each other. The National Guard had to be called in. It also speaks to what's happening right now in Minnesota, right? Where we're raising questions about can you show up at a protest with an armed, way. And to your point, these were people who were bringing assault rifles and trained dogs to a protest. I ran into someone who used to be on the board years ago, a couple of weeks ago, and he made a comment to me that said, "That's why I got out, and I just didn't want to have anything to do with it because of the politics." And That's sad to me. I thought it was interesting that the lieutenant governor said in his op-ed that he wrote about me that there's no place for politics at the Alamo. And I had to laugh, like, well, then what is this about, right? Who paid someone to do oppositional research on me and go find my dissertation and cull out specific bits that could be potentially controversial, right? That's not political. Um, but I agree with him. I feel like how sad for the Alamo that we use it as a political football. Um, it deserves more than that, and it deserves better than that, in my view.
Oh, it's a real shame because it's such an important thing, especially for us being in San Antonio, just how much of an economic driver it is for tourism and just, it's such a real cool thing. You can almost see the look in tourists' eyes when they first see
Yeah.
that thing they've been seeing in their history book all these years. It's such an amazing thing, and it certainly deserves better. But let me ask you this as I start to wrap this up. Almost every local leader, like I mentioned, supported you after the ouster. Was it meaningful for you that the leaders that knew you best, the ones that were in your backyard, so to speak, were the ones that were your loudest defenders?
I can't even express to you how much the support that I received meant to me. This was obviously very upsetting. I went through a really tough time right before the holidays. It was unexpected. I clearly feel that the way that I was treated was less than respectful, less than dignified. After having performed in the role and gotten good performance reviews, just got promoted in September, I just felt like the way the whole thing was handled was quite poor. Um, so yeah, to have people take time, everybody's busy, but people, it really reinvigorated my faith in the kindness of even strangers, and I will tell you the hardest part about this whole experience, if anyone, I pray they don't, but if anyone, has to go through something similar, like the president of Texas A&M just did, or, a professor, a school teacher, we're all at risk, which is part of what my lawsuit is about. We shouldn't be. This is the United States. You're supposed to be allowed to say what you think as a private citizen without repercussion, right? So yeah, but I did, in spite of all that, I found it to be very character revealing. Some people who I thought were my friends and my supporters were not, and that hurt, you know. Other people who I could never believe took time to write a beautiful op-ed to the paper or a letter to the lieutenant governor asking for my reinstatement. That's the most precious thing you can give to someone is your time. And the fact that someone felt so strongly and compelled to do that, it meant the world to me.
And I'll close with this one, end it on a positive note. In your 4+ years at the Alamo, what are you most proud of doing over there?
Far and away the team we built. We, I have no doubt the Alamo plan will continue. It will get done. It'll be wonderful for our community. Someday I'll bring my grandchildren there and tell them about the fact that I had a hand in it, in spite of efforts to sort of erase me from the story. I will continue to tell it. But the team that we have in place, from the education team to the guides on the grounds and so forth, just an amazing, committed, wonderful group of people. And I miss working with them.
I think that's a perfect place to close. That was Kate Rogers, the former CEO and president of the Alamo Trust. Kate, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Have a wonderful day.